Hello, this is Mrs. Taylor, and I'm going to walk you through how to factor this expression by completing the square. In this case, a equals 1, and all that means is the number in front of the squared term is 1. In other words, there's nothing there. If there's nothing in front of a variable, we know it's being multiplied by 1. So, the first thing we do when we're completing the square is we want to separate my terms with variables from this constant term. And so I'm going to use parentheses to do that. So I'm going to write k squared minus 8k in the parentheses and minus 48 there at the end. And then we also need to think about, okay, if I add a number here, I can complete the square. And all that means is that I want to choose a number that if I use the X puzzle and I factored this, I would get a binomial squared. An example of a binomial is k plus 3. And so there's a formula for that number. So to find this number, I divide the b value by 2 and then I square it. So the b value is the value in front of the k term. So negative 8 divided by 2 would be negative 4. And if I square that, I get positive 16. So that's the number I want to put in this blank to complete the square. Because if I did the X puzzle here, I would get k minus 4 squared, which is a binomial squared. That's what I want. But I have to remember that if I add 16 here, I have to subtract it from the end because we can't change the value of the expression. So whatever I add, I have to subtract, so I'm not changing anything. Okay, so once I have found the number that completes the square, now I rewrite this trinomial as the binomial squared. And the way I do that is I just have my parentheses with my squared and my k here. And then to find out the number that goes here, the constant that goes right here, what I would do is I'd take the b value and divide by 2. So the b value is negative 8, divided by 2, you get negative 4. And so this would be the example of the binomial squared. These two expressions in parentheses, with parentheses, are equal. If I did the X puzzle for this trinomial, I would get that. And then I combine the minus 48 and the minus 16, and that would be minus 64. So this would be my answer to factoring by completing the square. I have my binomial squared plus or minus whatever the constant. Now, there will be cases where a does not equal 1. So, for example, if I had 2n squared plus 12n plus 10, and the direction said factor by completing the square. What I have to do before I can even start this process is I have to factor out that 2. And this is different from what we were doing last week and the week before, because it's not a GCF. You don't factor it out of everything. You just factor it out of the first 2 terms, because remember, those are the 2 that we group. So what I do is I focus just on the first 2 terms. And what I factor out is the a value, the number in front of the square term. It does not matter what this term is. All I care about is getting rid of the 2 in front of the square term. So if I divide these by 2 to factor it out, that would become n squared plus 12 divided by 2 is 6, so plus 6n. So now I've taken care of the a value. It's now 1 if I just focus on what's in parentheses. So now I can repeat the same process I did up here. All I have to remember is to bring this 2 with me as I go. So I'm going to add in the blank that I need to complete the square. And remember, to find the number that goes on that blank, you divide b by 2 and square it. So b value here is 6. 6 divided by 2 is 3. 3 squared is 9. And remember, whatever I add, I have to subtract. But this is tricky because, remember, this 2 out front. So if I plugged in a number and did order of operations, I'd add and all that, and then I multiply by 2. And then I would add 10. So technically, if you really think about it, I'm not just adding 9, I'm adding 9 times 2, which is 18. So up here, I didn't have to worry about that because there's nothing out front of the parentheses. But down here, I do. And so instead of subtracting 9 at the end, I'd subtract whatever 9 times 2 is, which is 18. And so I rewrite my trinomial as the binomial squared, divide the b value by 2, so 6 divided by 2 is 3. So in other words, if I use the X puzzle on this trinomial, I would get this in factored form. And then 10 minus 18 is negative 8. And so that would be my expression after completing the square. 2 times n plus 3 all squared minus 8. And so that's just a quick refresher on how to factor by completing the square.